Hello, everyone. It's still December 12th, 2016, and I just got back from class recently, so I thought I would do another video because I don't have anything else to do. So recently, a lot of people, since I started putting up these videos, they've been giving me suggestions on what kind of video topics I should be doing and things that I should be sharing or could be sharing. And I've met quite a few people recently who were very curious about the traditions that I draw from and kind of my own practice, because I'm very much the last person to ever really talk about it. I'll talk about it with my spiritual group, but I won't really talk much about myself because I'm too busy asking questions about the other people. So I'll just briefly describe some of the areas that I work with right now, some of the traditions I draw from, how I became interested in those traditions, how I became part of those traditions, and how big they are in my life. So the biggest part of my spirituality right now, at least the tradition that I draw from, would be Hinduism. Right now, and for a large number of years in my life, Hinduism has been the mainstay, something I look towards, the tradition that I draw from quite heavily. Two of the major gods that I work with are Hindu, and in previous videos I talked about my experience of finding Wicca when I was about 15, and then being introduced to Hinduism when I was about 17, 18, and it was a very shallow beginning for me. I think I was more attracted to the very shallow, surface level exoticism. And just as I started reading more into it and becoming more interested in it, it started making more sense to me. And it on the surface level, it seems very, very different from European traditions, very different from Christianity and Judaism, Islam. And it is polytheistic, at least part of it is. So in university, I took I took quite a few courses in South Asian religion, and I studied it academically and kept reading books and books and books about it. I was also practicing. So when I was about 17 or 18, I got my first statue of Shiva, which I proudly placed on my altar with a little weird little thing around it. Yeah, so what attracts me to Hinduism is originally it was because it was so very different from anything I'd encountered before, and also the fact that people I respected and admired at that time were very heavily interested in it and working with it. As it became a source for me, I think what attracts me to it is that it is a polytheistic system which is still living. I often like to say that Western traditions like Greek and Roman religion would be what Hinduism is today if they had been allowed to continue. And as a living tradition, as a still breathing tradition, it has well over 3,000 years of history, and a lot of philosophy has grown up within it. I don't think it's an understatement to say that in Hinduism there is a stream of thought for every single other form of religion out there. It has its shamanism, it has its animism, it has its monotheism, it has its polytheism. And a book that really helped me to understand the philosophy and choosing the philosophical school that I would eventually really study and become part of, though not initiated. I have to put that out there. I'm not initiated into any particular tradition. So although I call myself Hindu, I'm not initiated into any particular sect or sampradaya or mata. But as a Western devotee of Shiva, this really did help me quite a bit, and it's The Essence of Vedanta by Brian Hodgkinson. And I mean, it really is an intro guide, but it was very well written. It really broke it down, and it broke down the major schools of thought. Now with Hinduism, it's interesting because there's all sorts of different levels. of how the tradition manifests, and that's why it's so diverse, and that's why I absolutely adore it, because there are so many different schools, there are so many different groups, there are so many different ways of viewing the same gods, the same scriptures, and on the surface level it can seem very overwhelming and very chaotic, because you've got groups which literally contradict each other. But when you understand the history of India, of the Indian subcontinent, and you understand that India was never one country, it was always, up until only recently, subdivided into different kingdoms, different language groups, different political entities. You know, the religion is very much a byproduct of that history. So you can have, you know, the same God worshipped in two different ways, having two different messages, all depending upon what sect is looking at it. So with Vedanta, for example, now Vedanta it refers to the four major books of the Vedas, which are kind of pre-Hindu Vedic, originally oral texts, which recount sacred verses and prayers and hymns to the Vedic deities. And somewhere along the lines there was a shift, an evolution, a change happened where new sets of gods came in and became important. But the Vedas are still classed as being the source. Now there's a whole history behind that, and behind those designations and categorizations. That's another book, another message for another time. But suffice it to say, the school of Vedanta that I follow and strongly connect with is called Advaita, which is non-dualistic. So that basically means that the Atman, which is very clumsily translated as soul, is the same as the Atman of the deity. So the supreme guru, the supreme Brahman, and there is no distinction. There is no separation. Like Buddhism, the idea that there is an illusion in the world which creates this distinction. So moksha, which is similar to nirvana, not the same though. Moksha would say that the awakening is when the piece of Brahman, the piece of God that's within me, that constitutes this form, suddenly wakes up and realizes that he's God, or that it is God. Then I as an individual merge with that God, and that's Advaita. The school was majorly popularized by a guru about 1500 years ago, named Adi Shankaracharya, who founded the major sects, or the major orders of Advaita, and he's seen now as an avatar of Shiva. His main deity was Shiva, but he was an amazing philosopher, and he basically went around the country debating with all the other rival schools. Now, obviously, in Advaita, he won those debates. In all the other schools, he didn't win those debates, but he is quite interesting. And a lot of popular ideas of what Hinduism is in the West actually comes from Advaita. Now, on the reverse of that, there's also, say, the Hare Krishna movement, which comes from Gaudiya Vaishnavism, which is a sect that worships Vishnu as the supreme god. And they come from a sect which believes that there is duality, at least my understanding, and that ultimately, you know, the ultimate Brahman is not the ultimate, because the ultimate is Godhead, is Krishna, who is higher than Brahman. So that's their take on all of this. In my sect, we don't subscribe to that. Brahman is Brahman is Brahman, is the ultimate, the final goal is God. Yeah? So anyways, as you can see, the philosophy part was very, very interesting to me. The gods and the rituals. Hinduism is one branch of what we call Indo-Aryan tradition, or Indo-European tradition, and actually it's quite incredible. Hinduism now looks and feels so different from European traditions, like the Celtic, the Roman, the Greek, but they all come from an original source. At least linguistically, now we don't know if ethnically it's the same, but linguistically and culturally, they all emerged from one culture. Now that doesn't mean that to say that they're all ethnically the same, but one culture group. So you have very many common features. Like, for example, in Hinduism there are sky gods, there are earth goddesses, there are a very common motif of the sky god holding a thunderbolt as his weapon, so Lord Indra. The same as the Greek Zeus, and the Germanic Tiwaz and Thor. Same with Finnish and Finno-Ugrian, very similar to Ukko and Perun. And actually in Slavic mythology is actually, at least the reconstruction of it is very similar to baseline Vedic Hinduism. So there's parallels. That could be a whole other topic. So my main deities that I worship within Hinduism are Shiva and Kali Durga. Shiva and Durga, or Parvati, are consort and consorts of each other. They are Shakti, or Shiva Shakti, and they form a very different sect from Vishnu and his consort, who are more of the city-based, the urban deities, whereas Shiva lives out in the wilderness. He's the god of yogis. He's often called the destroyer, but that's more to do with his aspect of destroying as a creative process, as a recreation process. So I work with them both, but as I grow older and I become more exploratory in understanding different other aspects of the tradition, I'm starting to understand that really the multitude of gods that are in Hinduism are just like many of the other Indo-European paganism. They're all aspects of nature, and so one has to look at nature as a whole. One has to see the different deities as manifestations of that nature, and see ourselves as part of that nature. So over the past few years, I've really shifted my focus and understanding, and I'm actually becoming a lot more interested in animism and shamanism, something that I've been quite lucky and fortunate to meet a few people in my life who are very seriously involved with animism and shamanism as a natural philosophy and religious practice. Although I have to say, religion and spirituality are very different for me. You know, religion is out there, it's deities out there, whereas spirituality is inside, right? So for me, I think my practice now is very much within that realm of spiritual and not religion. At one time, and as I said this in previous videos, at one time I was very focused on, it has to be done a certain way because that's tradition. And certainly when I practice Hindu traditions, I do it by the book, because that is where the power lies, that is where the tradition lies, that is the dialect that the deities understand. But as I grow older and I become more interested in looking into other traditions and incorporating elements of those traditions into my own path, I'm starting to understand that syncretizing and eclecticism aren't bad things if done properly and if done correctly and respectfully. So I'll give an example of this. I belong to quite a few Facebook groups, and I've been interacting quite a bit with members of all sorts of different paths. When I was in university, even before university, when I was just a teenager, I was looking into all sorts of different religions, and I've studied religion to the point where I have a good sense of the majority of religions around the world. Not all of them, but the majority of them, at least to strike up a conversation about them and learn more about them. And as I start to see religion throughout the world, connected as families, as connected as traditions, as lineages, as evolutions, religion really is like a tree, going right back to our most ancient ancestors. And the similarities are beautiful. They are all there. The underlying factors, the underlying psychology of religious tradition. So, I've studied religion quite a bit, and understand, I would say I understand a fair bit about the majority of religions. So for me, I've been heavily connecting with the conjure and the hoodoo community, because I have quite a few friends who practice those. I've been fascinated for a very long time with Orisha-based traditions from Africa, and specifically around the Orisha traditions of the Caribbean, and specifically, actually, and this ties back to Hinduism, specifically the traditions of Trinidad. And what made me interested in this was that if you look at the ethnic makeup of Trinidad, you have European descended people, you have Indian descended people, you have native South American descended people, and you have descendants of black slaves brought over from Africa. So you have these four major groups, and then you have, of course, the British colonialism aspect there. And in the Orisha tradition that has manifested there and has been built there, you have these mass gatherings where you have African deities coming in, you have Indian spirits coming in, you have Hindu spirits coming in, you have all these different spirits coming in from all of the different groups, and they all intermingle. They all connect with each other. They all interact with each other. So if you imagine a Haitian voodoo or a Santeria mass gathering, you have spirits, loas, orishas coming down and riding some of the participants, and being able to emerge as that spirit and talk and interact with the audience and participants. So in Trinidad, you would have Krishna dancing with Olokun, or you might have Yemaya, and you have say a Eric the Viking, Eric the Red coming in. So you have all of these different groups represented in the tradition, and I think that's where syncretism becomes very interesting, because it's an organic process, right? So I'm very, very interested in Orisha traditions. I've studied quite a fair bit the spirit traditions of Southeast Asia as connected with Buddhism. I've become very, very interested in Slavic and Finno-Ugrian traditions in Russia and Siberia. Lately, I've become very fascinated with with the Slavic, figuring out the deities there, and that underscores a lot of what I was saying before about the similarities. When you look at the manifestations of Indo-European cultures around the world, you see the same characteristics in each, even though the names have shifted, the symbolism might have changed. Each of them is unique, but each of them at the same time is connected in this branch, and it's absolutely amazing. It's very beautiful to see, and it gives me an appreciation for similarities versus then cultural unique or uniquely cultural aspects, right? In my own spirituality, in my own ancestor worship, I've been heavily looking into the stories of the UK, of the British Isles, and the peoples of the British Isles. About 5 years ago, I didn't know anything really about my family past my grandparents, It just didn't really come into my life. I heard stories from my parents, and when I started to look into genealogy and became interested in preserving those stories, I suddenly started to see the names of my ancestors, of my recent ancestors, understanding where they came from, what they were like, their stories, who they were. And I found out that, and I always knew this, but I didn't really know it at the same time. I found out that one of my great grandmothers was a Prendergast from Ireland. My grandmother's father was from Wick in Scotland, and one of my other great grandmothers was Welsh. So I was born in Wales, but my parents are English, and our origins, the family origin Stimson, comes from Norfolk, which tells us that probably they were Danish, like, 1,000 years ago, during the Dane Law. So to know, to hear about ancestors just in passing is one thing. To actually sit down and see within the past 6 generations that you have roots in all of these different countries, and all of these different cultures, it's quite an incredible feeling. But it made me very curious about all of those people. So I've heavily started looking into folklore and storytelling. And one of my friends, Brian Walsh, who is a very well-respected storyteller from Toronto, really started to show me, just by example, the power of storytelling and the importance of cultural stories. And so I started buying books, and I started becoming quite interested in the tales of those lands. And I gained an appreciation for those stories, because many times those stories are where our reconstruction of paganism comes from now. But I also started to become very interested and understand all the connections of those stories. Years and years ago, when I was a teenager, one of the main books that, actually, let me grab it for you. If I can find it. Where is it here? Yeah. So one of the main books that really got me interested in goddesses and gods and mythology was an incredible book by the name of Spirits, Fairies, Leprechauns and Goblins, by Carol Rose, who is, and I believe still is, a professor in Canterbury in Kent. And what it basically is it's an encyclopedia of spirits from all around the world. And when it's laid out like this, it's interesting because you see them all as individuals. When you start to study comparative mythology, you start to see the same folkloric motifs appear again and again and again. And this is partly because of migrations of people sharing stories on oral traditions, but also it's common psychological factors. So an example of this might be there are stories in the Canterbury Tales which have a direct link to the Indian epics known as the Panchatantra, or the 5 Tantras, that was written about 500 or written down about 500 years before. And so the migration of those core essence of the stories, fables, migrated into Persia, where they were told as stories. They were written down and changed ever so slightly to fit with the culture in Persia. Then they were transmitted to the Arabs, who wrote them down and put them into the 1001 Arabian Nights, which were then picked up in Italy, and they appear then as fables in an Italian source, which then are told to French traders, who then start telling them in England. And then they're circulating around England, just around campfires, around in city centres, word of mouth, in taverns. And then Geoffrey Chaucer then takes them and puts them into Canterbury Tales. So over 500 years, there's a migration of these stories, and I think that's quite divine in many ways. The fact that these stories can migrate and they link us. They change ever so slightly, almost like a chameleon circuit, to adapt to the cultures that they're entering, but they're the same messages, they're the same meanings. And then on the opposite side of that, you then have very culturally specific stories that only exist within those individual cultures. So you start to see culture as being a sponge, but also as a castle built, right? You start to see it as this construct, and I think that's in many ways what's contributing me seeing syncretism and eclecticism in a lot kinder sense now for me. So books, as you can tell behind me, books are some of my favorite things in the world. So when I started reading into the lores and the stories, one of my favorite books from when I was a child, and I actually lost this book. I lent it to somebody when I was a teenager, and they moved away, and I never got it back from them. So I had to buy it again. But it's I remember being given this as a kid, and it's Ghosts and Legends of Wales. And I mean, it's only a thin little volume, but it's all just going around, and it's talking about ghost stories and legends and monster tales and stories about the Itel Teg and the fairies and all these others. And I just loved it. So when I started to actually read more into folklore again and took that hobby up again, I decided, well, one book isn't going to give me a good sense. So I started to order a load of more. So one of my absolute favorites right now, and I've lent it out many, many times, and every single time it's come back to me. So thank you, people I've lent it out to. But it's by Richard Holland, who is a very well-known folklorist in North Wales, and it's Supernatural Clwyd. The folk tales of northeast Wales, and Clwyd is where I'm from. So when I got this and I started reading through, like most of the places listed in here are places I knew and know about and have visited when I was a kid or when I went home. So that was quite exciting. Then I picked up two books that were, I just love them. And it's by Jennifer Westwood, who is a very well-known and well-respected folklorist, and she sadly passed away on us in, I think, 2009 I think she passed away. But it's The Fabled Coast, and it's The Lore of Scotland. She's also done a few other books that I have on my shelf over there, but I don't want to fill my desk up with shelves. And it's literally going county by county, town by town, listing all of the unique stories and also the motifs. And what I love about these books is that whenever there's a common motif appear, they'll make reference of it, and they'll say, this is a very common motif, and other versions of it can be found in this location, this location, this location. And so reading through these, you get a good sense of what the individuals in certain localities believed, how they might have received those stories, how the stories adapted to that location, and it gives a greater appreciation, especially The Fabled Coast, which goes around all of the British Isles and Ireland. It gives a very good idea of what the different peoples in different parts believed and told, and the vast majority of our stories come from medieval times. So it's quite an interesting read, and I very much I'm very glad that I bought these books, because every time I open one of these pages, it's as if the story just jumps out at me. I think I'm going to do another video on oral storytelling versus reading written down stories, because there is a difference, and it's something I've been learning quite a bit and appreciating quite a bit through talking to individuals who come from traditions that are very based in their own cultures, and I think for these there definitely is a difference between the oral versions which form lineages, versus, you know, reading one that is written down and only reading that one version, and not reading versions that can change and adapt and come to life, right? So I've really started to explore my roots, started to explore the well, I haven't started to explore, I've been exploring. You know, a lot of what I've been doing has been over the past 2 years, 3 years, so it's an ongoing process. But I've really started to reconnect with where my family comes from, the beliefs of those people, and it's all tied in with my ancestor worship and working with my ancestors, and that's been quite a powerful it's been quite a powerful identity builder for me, because going from being just an immigrant kid in a country where I don't feel like I belong, with no roots whatsoever, and being old enough to remember that original country, to suddenly knowing where my roots are from, and then being able to transmit that to the next generation, it's very empowering, and it does honor the ancestors in many ways, and they, you know, the ancestors, and understanding what they believe, the stories that they told, the spirits that they interacted with, it helps to make me feel more connected to something, as opposed to feeling always like an outsider, feeling always like I was different, and that I didn't have any roots. So yes, so that's it. That's in, I don't know how long it's been, but that's basically the traditions that I'm connected with, what I'm interested in. And I realize it's very difficult to actually talk about that when I'm not prompted. So thank you for listening to my driveling. It's been 30 minutes. I don't know how I managed to fill these movies 30 minutes long, but thank you very much for listening, if you're still with me, and I look forward to talking to you in the future. Have a good day. Bye-bye.